So my archery journey, which started 8-9 years ago, has gone through some pretty interesting directions. I think some people might relate to it, but I think what I've done overall has been rather unique, and what I'm holding right here is perhaps a good reflection of that. Over here I've got the Crown Eagle by Harvey Archery, which I reviewed recently, and over here I've got the Raptor by Simon's Bow Company, and both of these are very high quality bows and dramatically different in their design and function. So I thought this would be a nice chance to reflect on my experiences with different archery styles, namely looking at how I feel about shooting both Western and Eastern archery styles. And I want to point out that I deliberately chose not to use the word versus in this title or thumbnail. I think that sets up the wrong impression of archery styles and communities. So I think we should be talking about archery as a unified community rather than splitting along the lines of English archery or Western archery and then Asiatic archery. So I think there are more similarities than differences. And I think when we play the stereotypes, it gets pretty repetitive. I mean, Western archery is all about static, slow shooting, while Eastern archery is about speed shooting and combat archery. And I think these are very polarized and not very representative of what we actually do in either style. So what I thought I'd talk about here is basically what it felt like for me to learn both styles in the capacities I have, and what I think are some of the similarities and differences for those of you who might be interested and curious about trying a different style. For those who don't know my background, I started, as with most people, with a beginner course at a local archery club, and we learned Western archery. So we learned with typical traditional bare bows, and we shot using instinctive archery. I was then moved onto the pathway to become what we call the Olympic archery track, so Olympic recurve or modern recurve. So we shoot with sights and stabilizers, and that, for the most part, has been my primary or base style. So for the first 3-4 years of my archery career, that's basically what I specialized in, and I eventually became a coach in that role. So I learned to become a coach through Archery Australia, and I received later on instruction on coaching from Coach Keith Lee, who is the National American coach and one of the best Olympic coaches. So my formal background and accreditation is in Olympic archery. By extension, I have only done a bit of experimentation in bare bow archery, and I've touched a compound once. I think compound's a different beast. It's a very technical and mechanical style of archery, so while it is Western archery, it's not really what I do, so I'm kind of leaving it out of this discussion, but you can probably see where we're coming from. And while I'm not formally trained in traditional archery, the principles are basically the same thing. So I do shoot traditional bows, traditional recurves, traditional longbows. I don't shoot English longbow at the moment. That might change, but I mostly shoot traditional longbow and recurve. As for the Eastern styles of archery, I actually wasn't exposed to much of it. I probably was more of a book knowledge person when it comes to Eastern archery. I was kind of pushed to it because my father absolutely hates Western archery. He thinks it's all fancy and dazzling and useless, whereas Mongolian archery was his favorite. He always talks about Mongolians and how they conquered the world, and their shooting styles are more realistic, that sort of thing. So I had a bit of a bias at home, so I wanted to please my dad in some way, and I eventually picked it up. I suppose in some way, I guess my interests spiked up, I guess, with the Lars Anderson fad in 2015. Not because he inspired me, but because a lot of people were attacking me and saying that you obviously can't talk about Lars Anderson unless you shoot like him. So I guess that kind of set me the motivation to learn Asiatic archery and experiment and learn more from different people. And I thought, yeah, that's a pretty good idea. Might as well expand repertoire and go from book knowledge to practical knowledge. So, and the first opportunity came from one of the Mandarin Duck partnerships, where they sent me a traditional bow, and from there on I started collecting more Asiatic bows. And I've had the chance to learn from some official settings. I've had one introductory session to Kudo at Melbourne Kudo Kai. and I have had some sessions with the Turkish archery groups, one in Melbourne, Archery Ascension, as a bit of a primer, and I've spent some time with Art and Karat in Sydney with the Maidan Archery Club. And as with many people who do Asiatic, if you're not learning it from a group or a club, then most of us are reading sources like Arab Archery or Gao Ying's Way of Archery, which is translated by Jitian and Justin Ma. So a lot of this is self-taught, self-experimentation, as well as where possible learning from other people. So I probably have a more diverse skill set than most people who get into archery. I'm not a master of every art, of course, but I think I've done enough foundation work to appreciate what both styles really stand for. And I want to share some of those thoughts in this video. First, I want to talk about the similarities, because there's probably more in common than there are differences. And I think people, again, polarize the differences more than similarities, but they're actually quite the same. And I think it's actually quite easy for someone who's done one style to pick up the other style. I know just for a fact that because Western archery is the dominant archery today, I think many people will start off with Western archery, whether because the club only teaches Western archery, or they've bought a recurve bow or a compound bow, and they've later discovered traditional schools which teach Eastern archery. That's what I find in my experiences with the club so far, and that's a pretty accurate reflection, I think, of what most people experiment with. But there's no reason why you can't switch from one to the other or do both. There's actually a lot that are similar, and the foundation skills are pretty much the same. One thing that is particularly striking when looking at Eastern and Western styles is form and structure. The use of good alignment and good back tension and expansion are the same in all the styles. So again, it's not so different where you can't pick up a different bow and use it. In fact, you can. The techniques are very similar. But the foundations that we often struggle to teach people because they require a lot more time, a bit more discipline and focused training. If you already have this from one kind of archery, you can translate that to another without that much difficulty. So while there are some technical differences, the thumb versus the finger draw, which side of the bow to use, the structure of the shoulders, the alignment, the positioning are very similar regardless of which style you use. So that was something which, if you know how to do it from, say, Western archery, once you learn the specifics of thumb draw, then you can apply the same thing to Eastern archery and vice versa. And I find that people who come with no background in either style will still have the same challenges in learning things like expansion and back tension. And related to that is the feeling of a good shot. That's something we all strive for. When we have a shot, we go, oomph, oh, that feels good. You feel that good vibration through your body. You feel the firm control. You feel that your body can handle it. That's a very satisfying feeling, and you get it from both styles. So the feedback that comes from good process, good form, this resonates in both Western and Eastern archery. Whether you shoot with a longbow or a recurve or an Asiatic bow, that oomph you get is the same. And finally, both styles can be shot instinctively. I know with Western archery, we tend to push more towards aiming, so things like gap shooting, string walking, or using sights. They tend to push more towards more precise shooting and getting higher scores. But instinctive shooting is very much a thing. It's perhaps the most natural way, and many people who do archery casually only shoot instinctively, and that's something that's not unique to either Asiatic or Western. You can definitely shoot instinctive with Western. Asiatic archery, it's almost mostly instinctive, but there are ways to aim with both. But yeah, I don't find that it's particularly different from both styles. You can definitely immerse yourself in instinctive shooting for both Western and Eastern archery. As for differences, well, technique is obviously a little different. The Eastern styles mostly use thumb draw, and they mostly shoot from the right side of the bow. And as most of my audience are Western archers, I know people freak out when they see me shoot like this, because they see me put the arrow on the wrong side and they think, well, hang on, that's illegal, you can't do that. And of course, that's normal for Eastern archery. We don't really make a big deal about it, this is the way it is. And it's not hard to learn, especially coming over from Western archery. Again, we said before, the foundation is stance, body structure, alignment. These things are the same. You have to learn how to knock on the right side and use a thumb ring. And Most beginners often shoot far to the right because they're not used to the offset alignment, but in most cases you can learn how to shoot thumb draw proficiently within an hour. Again, the hardest things to learn with archery are often the basics, whereas once you have the basics, switching styles is more or less straightforward. I think the more interesting differences to talk about are to do with the overall approach to archery, the whole mindset, the mentality behind each style. And this is going to be very broad, but I think this can be summarized as Eastern archery has more of a military grounding, whereas Western archery has more of an individual recreational grounding. Now again, this is not a specific and accurate representation, but understand where it comes from. In Western cultures, and archery has been used for hunting everywhere, but in Western cultures, while it has been used as a military weapon, it was never the dominant military weapon. It's only when we see, say, English archery, where we start recognizing the power of the bow and the required mandatory training every weekend. But that sort of thing was more a civilian act, to get more civilians to take up the bow and archery as a pursuit. In Eastern cultures, the bow has been a part of military culture for centuries. It's been a part of the warrior culture, and basically to be a trained warrior, you had to learn how to use a bow, not just a bow on foot, but a bow on horseback. And a lot of Eastern styles direct towards horseback archery. And whether you shoot on horseback or not is a different thing, but the techniques and the equipment are typically adapted for rapid engagements, for mounted archery. So it makes more sense to see a more dynamic style of shooting in Eastern archery styles. One way we see this difference in culture is in the way we shoot. In Western archery, most of the styles of shooting are based on static archery. So, for example, a typical target competition is static shooting. You stand in one place, you shoot at targets. Cloud archery, you stand in one place, you shoot at a very long distance target. You have even field archery or 3D archery, which is more or less you walk around, but you stand on one spot, you shoot at a target, whether standing or kneeling or a mix of both, same sort of thing. It's mostly you stand still, you look at a target and you shoot. Very much a civilian thing, sporting, recreational, and these things can hone someone's skill for hunting or for competition or for warfare, but it's mostly stand in one spot and shoot, which is how a lot of European and Western archers would have been used in warfare if necessary, but in most cases people were doing this sort of thing as a regular practice. This was their normal kind of archery. I know some people will make the argument that historical archery is meant to be battlefield ready and rapid and dynamic. That may be true for some kinds of archery. I don't think it's true for Western archery. I think the way Western archery culture developed has mostly been around civilian recreational practice, with the end goal having some people fight in warfare, but for the most part the culture which we retain today, the Western archery culture, is mostly target shooting. In Eastern archery, we often see it more as a military activity or martial activity because it never really left its military background, even though it's no longer used for military purposes. And of course, most people today do it as a sport or recreation. But the historical sources and texts which are used to teach traditional archery in Eastern styles are military texts. We have well-known sources like Taibuga and Mamluk archery, we have Gaoying and Ming archery, and we've got numerous sources for Korean and Japanese and so on. And these sources were produced for military archers specifically. And of course, as I said before, the culture was that the bow was the primary weapon. So unsurprisingly, as an art form, it was highly respected. And again, I'm being general here, but the focus of practice and target shooting isn't so much to be precise and score points, but just to be guaranteed to hit the target. In Turkish archery, you have the puta target, and it doesn't matter where you hit it, as long as you hit it. Similar thing with Korean archery, you have like a 2-meter board at 145 meters, and it's not about where you hit, but whether you hit or not. Same in Bhutan. A lot of the mentalities with these competitions is hit the target. And if you think about the military context, this makes sense. If you're shooting at a 50-meter target and you hit that puta, that means you can hit a person at 50 meters. If you can hit a 2-meter board at 150 meters, that means you can hit a mounted fighter at 150 meters. And by extension, you have activities like mounted archery, where again, the main goal is to hit the target. You have traditional Ottoman horseback archery, you have Yabusame in Japan, where it's not really about points, it's about make sure you can knock and hit the target. Now, modern competition might make more use of points, but I think the main focus is proficiency and technique rather than scoring points and precision. Another way we see this martial difference is the way we teach archery. So in Eastern archery, it's often a bit more aggressive and dynamic. So you have a much tighter grip. You have a more dynamic pose where you lean forward a bit more. You want to use more of your body, your whole body, your hips, your legs, your shoulders. You're taught, for example, to punch the target on release. So the whole shot feels like you're moving your whole body. Of course, we see similar things in Western archery. Of course, if you do things like English longbow, where you're pulling a heavy weight, you're using your whole body. But in normal Western archery, it's often just an upper body thing. You're focused on your arms, your shoulders, your upper body for alignment. Whereas in Eastern archery, there's more of a whole body movement. And something else I picked up in Eastern archery is that, well, when you consider battlefield archery or military archery, a lot of the things you were taught for target don't really matter that much. So for example, if you're mostly based on foot or you're doing target archery, you're taught to have, in some cases, an open stance and you lean quite far forward for Ming archery. You might have a more square stance for, say, Turkish archery. But ultimately, most people who are doing this historically will be fighting on horseback. And that means no matter what technique you use, you should be able to do it while facing forwards, facing to the side, facing backwards. And that's something which I find is much more dynamic with Eastern archery, is the inclusion of these military scenarios. And again, if you're not shooting from horseback, it's still ingrained in basic training for archery. So you still practice things like different stances on foot or sideways or backwards. And that's something unique, I find, to Eastern archery. Whereas in Western archery, again, because it's mostly derived from hunting and from sport, most of the techniques and styles are specialized towards a particular goal. So because you are not pressured to shoot quickly or with powerful bows most of the time, then we can take our time, pick out the most comfortable and optimal stance, use sights or aim, and do the cleanest shot we can. And again, these things are super satisfying, but different mental focuses or different holistic focuses. And those are my general thoughts on Eastern and Western archery as someone who practices both. I don't really think it's about specific things like which one's faster, which one is more accurate. I think it's more of the overall approach, the holistic approach to archery and why it exists. I think people now often look at these different diverging styles and think, well, this one's better, this one isn't. But these styles develop for a reason. And again, some people are more drawn to the sport or the hunting side. Some people are more drawn to the martial side or the military side. I know for me personally, because my background was originally target, that's what I thought I would enjoy. After doing a lot of Asiatic, I really do enjoy the martial side. I think my temperament is more suited to an Eastern style of archery, which makes sense about who I am. So, that might explain why I feel a little uneasy when doing target archery with Western bows, Special Olympic recurve. It's my main discipline only because it's what was available to me. But I never found I got into it as much as I should have, and I always wondered why. And when I do Asiatic, I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I like the feeling, I like the mentality, I like the discipline. And that sort of thing is what appeals to me personally. Doesn't mean it reflects the entire style. And that leads me to you. For those of you who do either one or the other or both, what is it which appeals to you about that particular style? Post your thoughts and comments below. Thanks for listening to me share my experiences. I'm NUSensei, and hopefully you enjoy your archery, whichever style you do.